Chapter 10: Bonfire, Pig Farming, New Barn, the House. The spring of 1951 was beautiful, and crops looked very promising. I had hired Bern Vanderkock, a new Canadian immigrated from Holland. He and his wife, Femi, were probably the nicest people we ever had living in the spare house. They came to Canada in 1948 and had worked for Mr. Perkin near Galt for a year before coming to me in 1949. Bern was honest, hard-working, ambitious, and clever, a good living man, slow to anger, and quick to respond to any kindness. He had started with me, he knew little or no English, and it was my extreme pleasure to teach as we worked together. As he advanced, I attempted to pick out single words and explain their meaning. We trimmed 2 rows of grapes, each while I got through all the different meanings of a simple word like beet. We had many laughs and discussions, and as time passed, we became good friends. In fact, Lib and I were godparents to his firstborn. Both the fruit business and the hogs were steadily increasing profits. In the fall of '50, I spent over $1,000 repairing the barn. A new aluminum roof and many steel stay rods to pull all the sides in at the top, and thus take some of the sag out of the ridge, used up most of the money. I also bought 20 full-grown young sows, most of them already bred, at a cost of about $100 apiece during the last part of April 1951. It was shortly after dinner on the 24th of May, as I was returning to reload the sprayer, that I noticed a little bit of smoke coming out of the top of the west end of the barn. I put the tractor in high gear and lost little time coming to the house. Lib had already phoned for the fire department in Stony Creek. It was a volunteer fire brigade, and although there was nobody at the station when the call came in, the fire truck arrived at the fire with a full crew in less than 8 minutes. During that 8 minutes, I had filled the sprayer tank, 160 gallons, from the 500-gallon tank on the truck, which was parked on the hill in McBride's backyard. The aluminum roof seemed to contain the fire until the heat melted a small hole. Then seconds later, the roof was flames from end to end and about 75 feet high. I gave up trying to save the old garage, the closest building to the barn, when I saw the fire truck turning the corner. At this point, I was certain the whole corner would burn to the ground. 3 houses and the 2 small garages plus the 500-gallon underground gasoline tank within 50 feet of the fire. Without the valiant efforts of the firemen, they would have been gone. They passed a man with a fire hose between the barn and Bern's house, who kept the house, the garage, and the gas pump alternately wet, as he directed it from one to the other. The heat became intense, and the second hose was directed at the first fireman in order to keep him cool enough to remain at his post. In the meantime, Bern was in the basement of the barn trying to get the pigs out of their pens. He stayed there far past the safety point and gained nothing. Every pen door was open, and the pigs driven out. Once they arrived at the open basement doors and heard the roar of the fire outside, they returned to the only safety place they ever knew, their own pens. It was really disgusting to listen to their terrified squeals of about 120 pigs as the fiery floor collapsed on top of them. At the same time, the firemen directed Femi to get out of the house while others helped carry most of the furniture and what few possessions they had to the safety of the front lawn. The heat was so intense it cooked the flowers to a dark brown, which Femi had lined up in front of the window facing the barn, even though the storm window had not been removed. Then, when everything seemed hopeless, the wind shifted to blow from the north and took all the excess heat away from the buildings which we were so sure were doomed. Lib was just as busy as I was. Bill and Irvy Schwab dropped in on their way to buy a bed in Hamilton, and when Lib suggested there may be one stored in the barn that might be good enough, the 3 of them went out to look. Before they got halfway, they noticed the smoke about the same time as I had. She first phoned the fire department and then proceeded to warn Femi. Bern's sister and brother-in-law were living temporarily with them, John and Joanna Lindboom. They also had a small baby about the same age as Bern's. As things looked progressively worse, Irvy volunteered to take Flo and Tom down to their place about a half mile away, and they moved the 2 babies to our front hall to make sure they could be easily carried to safety. Lib had thought that it was utterly ridiculous that 4 grown men had walked empty-handed from the fire at the hunt camp. To her, it was unreasonable that we did not grab pants, shoes, and coat as we passed them. After this fire, she had no trouble changing her opinion. It happened at the peak of the excitement that one of the firemen came to the house to ask her for a pail and dipper, to give those on duty a drink. Her mind was a total blank. She did not know where to look for one, nor did she ever think to give him their own pail and dipper sitting at the end of the kitchen counter. By 4 o'clock, the damage was done and the danger past. Every building on the corner except our house was on fire at one time or another, so undoubtedly they would have burned without the terrific work of the Stony Creek volunteer firemen. The water was supplied by 2 tank trucks, my own and one owned by Ron Duxbury. I don't know who drove mine, but between them, they hauled enough water from Stony Creek to keep the pumper at full capacity. The crowds of people milled around to add to the confusion as firemen switched hoses from one place to another. It is hard to believe that there were those in that crowd with such little respect for other people's problems or properties that they would stoop to stealing bunches of lilacs growing near the back of the house. Those who knew me, and there were many, offered their sympathy and assistance, but out of the whole group, Mr. Harry Bigger was the only one who donated $10. The firemen remained on duty until nearly midnight to be sure that the sudden breeze did not scatter sparks from the smoldering ruins. The next day, the insurance adjuster appeared and helped me to remember the contents of the barn, and when the list exceeded the value of the policy, we quit. The barn was insured for $1,800 and the contents for $5,000. There was no doubt that the building was a total loss, but the adjuster required reasonable proof of its contents, which was not quite so easy from a pile of ashes. He had to accept my word for quantities of such things as pigs, feed, straw baskets, ladders, tools, etc., etc., and he was not satisfied until my figures reached $7,000. After he was satisfied, it was necessary to agree to rebuild the barn before the Farm Loan Board, which held the mortgage, would pass the insurance money on to me in spite of the fact that the money owing was less than the settlement. Normal operation of the farm had to continue, and it seemed that every job we did required that I buy something to replace that which we lost in the fire. My supplies of feed, such as ice cream cones and milk, were still available to me, and with no place to store them, I decided to buy more pigs. The problem of where to put them was solved by George Lounsbury. He had an old barn on the plateau directly behind the apple orchard that he used to store outdated implements. He very graciously allowed me to fence the side hill up to the barn and use it for the storage and mixing of the feed. There was a well outside the barn that George believed to be strong enough to supply water for all the pigs that I wanted to buy. I went to Ancaster auction sale and bought over 100 pigs of all sizes. The largest cost about $21 apiece and the smallest about $12. They varied in weight between 35 and 110 pounds. You have never seen pigs grow as fast as that bunch. This is early in July, so the weather is delightful, the days long, the grounds that they were on were new, which eliminated the possibility of being infected with disease. They had lots of room for exercise, the trees on the hillside provided protection from the sun's warming rays. Conditions were ideal. They could dig in their dirt, run a quarter mile, up or down, sunbathe, or just laze in the shade. There is a knack to feeding pigs. The aim is to stuff as much feed in the pigs as possible, which sounds comparatively easy, but turns out to be exceptionally difficult. The trick is to find the amount of feed that will fill them, just short of their capacity. To overfeed will stall them, and they will eat very little for several days. To underfeed will extend the period of time required to get them to the desired weight because it takes a certain amount of feed to sustain them. Therefore, the amount of feed over the sustaining level gives you the only profit in the game. Byrne had learned this art in Holland, and I know no one could do it better job, including myself. As soon as he began to mix the feed, the pigs would start to squeal, loud enough to be heard back at the house a quarter mile away. Every pig in the 110 would clamor for a position at the trough to get their first mouthful before any of the others. The trough was long enough to accommodate about 1/4 of the group, so it was a continuous battle until they were all full. They gained in excess of 2 pounds per day each. Towards the end of August, the well petered out, and we had to then haul water by the truckload. To clean up that mess of ashes and half-cooked pigs from the basement of the barn was undoubtedly the worst job I have ever encountered. With so many other things to attend to, it was impossible to get started at the job soon enough after the fire. The stench from the partially decaying pigs was indescribable, and what to do with them. With the slush scraper mounted on the tractor, we dug long trenches between the rows of apple trees, 2 feet wide and about 16 inches deep. The scraper was a reversible type, borrowed from Jack Orr, so we backed into each body and drove away with whatever part would stick on long enough to get to the apple orchard. Bern and I took turns at that job, and the smell got so bad that we had to wear masks to avoid becoming sick at our stomachs. When that job was finally complete, the next was to rebuild a barn that would serve the pig business as well as the fruit growing. Murray Burnham's uncle, Hugh Griffin, from Halliburton, came in to see us just shortly after the fire, and he, like many others, offered to help. He owned and operated a sawmill near West Guilford and suggested, when I was ready to start building, to see him about lumber. It took a bit of thinking to line up things to serve to the best advantage. I drew plans to scale what I thought was ideal and presented them to Mike Martin, one of the local carpenters. He made a few minor changes and agreed to be my boss carpenter. The old barn was built on the edge of a hill, commonly known as a bank barn. The south and east walls were fully exposed, and the north and west walls were buried in the side hill. This meant that the floor of the basement was at ground level at the south and east. The second, or main floor, was also at ground level on the north and west. It was a distinct advantage to be able to drive vehicles on the level onto both floors. The building was 40 feet by 60 feet, with a longer distance running east to west. In the middle of the north wall, we allowed for a 12-foot by 12-foot door and a 14-foot alleyway, the full width of the building. The hip roof was 20 feet high from the top of the 8-foot wall on the main floor. On each side of the alleyway, we built a loft, or third floor. The west loft to be used for baskets and hampers, and the east loft, straw or ice cream cones. We were able to use the old stone foundation of the north and west walls, but the other two were too far away to be of any value. They were torn down and replaced with 10-inch cement blocks. Before we did this, Bern talked me into draining the basement floors into a 10,000-gallon cement cistern, which we built outside the southeast corner, below ground level. George Wallace did the block laying for 20 cents each on both floors. I bought 20 window sash used from the Terrace Dance Hall at $1.50 each. One for each gable end, and the rest for all the walls on the main floor. They were 4.5 feet by 2.5 feet. The 14 windows for the basements were new, costing $4.50 each. In an effort to get away from as much wood as possible, we decided to use 7-inch I-beams to support the main floor. Jim Douglas figured the stress and strain for the whole building, and we went close to his recommendations. It took 1.5 tons of 5/8-inch steel rods for the reinforcing of the cement cap over the basement. This cap served two purposes. One, it made a beautiful floor for the main floor. With a capacity of 250 tons, it was strong enough to carry anything I might have, equally as well in any section. Two, it practically eliminated the possibility of losing the livestock should there ever be another fire. The cost was only $200 more than wood construction. I bought the 60-foot I-beams from Hamilton Tank and Bridge, located in the west end of Hamilton. They were 10 feet longer than the law allows on public highways, so I had to get a permit from the Department of Transport to get them home. They weighed about 1,300 pounds each, and their length made them awkward to handle without bending them. Elwood Mooney, the local garage man, drove his wrecking truck, and I drove my truck. With a chain between the trucks to maintain the distance apart, we came home in great style with the beams on top of both trucks. Corners were tricky, and getting them down to the ground was an engineering feat. Bob Slack was in the trucking business, hauling hay, straw, manure, and what have you. We were good friends, and he had just bought his first new Rio truck. He knew my problems and gave Ma a price of $50 to haul a load of lumber from Uncle Hugh Griffin's sawmill in West Guilford, a distance of 200 miles. I rode with Bob, and I will tell you, it was a real experience. Neither of us had ever hauled lumber before, so our knowledge of the game was nil. We arrived at the mill about 9:00 a.m. and loaded all the dry hemlock boards, 1 inch thick, that Uncle Hugh had to sell us. He phoned Hay & Co., another larger mill 10 miles further, and made arrangements for us to buy more. While he was phoning, Bob got in a friendly argument with Uncle Hugh's son Noel about the size of the chains we had with us to secure the load. Noel claimed they were much too large and heavy. Bob claimed that they would break if they were smaller. It was fun to listen to the exaggerated statements on both sides. Noel said if we had brought the proper size change, we could haul another 1,000 feet of lumber and still have the same gross weight. Bob said the small chains would snap on the first corner and it would take 2 days to put the load back on. Noel, like all northern people, had absolutely no respect for material things. Lying on the ground nearby was a brand new chain, 30 feet long and half the size of ours. The argument finally got around to whether Bob's big Rio could pull that chain apart. Noel put the chain around the biggest tree available and hooked the other end to Bob's front bumper. "There now," he said. "If you don't jerk it, you can't break it." Bob was reluctant to ruin a perfectly good chain, but it was too late to back down. Bob got behind the steering wheel and backed gently until the chain was tight. The rear wheels spun as he tried again and again. The chain never broke. When he finally gave up and tried to unlock it from the truck, it was no better than a piece of steel rod. Every link had been stretched so badly it would no longer bend, definitely useless. Noel's statement, "See, I told you, you couldn't break it." There isn't an acre of level ground in the whole area in the narrow, high-crowned road wound round hills and valleys all the way to Hay & Co. The lumber I needed was green and wet and about twice as heavy as that which we had on the bottom of the load. We had about 9 tons of lumber, 3/4 was above the roof of the cab. It cost me $35, 1,000 board feet compared to $120 at home. Bob was accustomed to hauling top-heavy loads of hay and straw, but he had to admit that this was by far the worst he had ever had. The hills were long, crooked, and steep, and we had 9 tons on a 3-ton truck, which left hardly any reserve power for the uphills and half enough braking power for the downgrades. We dare not to leave the center of the road because of the high crown and the possibility of tipping. He must have shifted gears 1,000 times before we came to a paved road. I really don't know what would have happened if we had met someone going the other way during that first 20 miles. We arrived back home about 2:30 a.m., backed the truck behind the barn, loosened the chains, lifted the load at the front with the hydraulic dump about 30 degrees, put the truck in gear and literally jumped out from under the load, hardly disturbed the pile. The second load went much better, having learned a few things from the first. For Bob, this was the beginning of his retail lumber business, which by now must have reached the $1 million mark. Mike Martin proved to be the best possible choice for Boss Carpenter. I hired a couple of extra men and the neighbors came to help when they could. Mike kept them all working regardless of the number and did a full day's work himself. After the basement walls were completed, the next job was to build a form on which to pour the cement cap. This required dozens of uprights beside these steel I-beams to support the anticipated 52 cubic yards of concrete. Art Bentley supplied 2 gasoline-driven mixtures and 2 men besides himself. I had purchased a full carload of bagged cement from Smithville Co-op, and Elwood Mooney hauled the sand and stone. We placed the reinforcing rods the widths of the building, 1 foot apart, about 2 inches from the bottom of the concrete. Directly over the I-beams, we placed another set of rods 8 feet long and 2 inches from the top. We got the ball rolling early in the morning and finished pouring by 5:30 p.m. After supper, Art put a smooth finish on it with a gas-driven rotary machine. Needless to say, everyone went to sleep easily that night. As soon as George Wallace finished the cement block work on the main floor, we proceeded with the lofts and the roof. Mike was a real slave driver, and it made little difference to him whether the labor was hired or donated. One guy complained to me that he had to buy tailor-made cigarettes because Mike would not give him time to roll one. Another made 2 passes with a pencil while marking a board to be cut, and Mike yelled, "What are you trying to do? Cut it off with the pencil?" Murray Burnham gave me a few days, and as he was a qualified carpenter, Mike suggested that he board in the west gable. Mike was sheeting the roof directly above where Murray was working, and every time Murray would get set to nail another board, Mike asked him to hand him something he wanted. When noon came, Mike gave Murray proper hell for not having the end finished. Building a barn, feeding pigs, and taking in the fruit harvest all at the same time surely made for a busy summer. With no building available, we did most of the fruit packing on the front lawn, and it was amazing how many people stopped to buy whatever we were working on at the time. This was the beginning of the retail business, which grew steadily from year to year until it constituted nearly half of the profit realized from the sale of fruit. The barn, when completed, was a thing of beauty. Sturdily built, serviceable, and with plenty of windows, it was more than just a barn. The cement floors and walls, plus the steel roof, afforded the maximum fire protection, and the layout proved to be just what I wanted. Even with the great amount of donated labor and the saving on the lumber, the cost was over $7,000, which resulted in a loss of about $12,000 on the fire. A bitter pill to take. Shortly after the middle of September, the weather turned abnormally cold, especially the nights. The pigs that had been growing so fast in the open air really slowed down. They ate the same amount, but it seemed to require all the feed they could eat to supply heat for their bodies. I bought a big load of baled straw and built a wall for the windbreak inside the pen. Within 24 hours, the wall was nothing more than a small pile of straw scattered all over. As the barn was not yet completed, I was forced to sell all of them. Those close enough to the weight went to Gord Roberts, the butcher, and the rest went to the auction sale. With the exception of Peninsula Lumber Co., my creditors were most generous in allowing me extended time to pay. Ira Jacobs, from whom I purchased all the spray material, just held my bill until the fall of the next year. There are no records to show the amount of fruit sold for 1951, and only a few of the many bills I must have accumulated. I am afraid I fall in the same category as my grandfather when it comes to bookkeeping. Pretty awful. I can remember paying a little to each in an effort to keep them all happy. The only one not satisfied to wait was Peninsula Lumber, and they bugged me consistently. Walter Scott, the manager at the Stony Creek branch of the Royal Bank, advised me to borrow enough extra money to pay them off. In order to do this, it was necessary to take a statement of my assets and liabilities. Without any concrete evidence, we proceeded to make a list of my debts. As the total grew, I could see Walter getting more worried. Finally, he asked me, "How many more are there?" I replied, "I don't really know, but there are quite a few." He said, "I hope you realize that if you put too much on this list, there is a good possibility that head office will not sanction the loan." He ended the list there, sent it to head office, and I received my loan. With friends like Walter Scott, who had that much faith in my honesty and ability, it made the struggle towards the top a heck of a lot easier. Later, in order to restock the barn with pigs, I decided the only way was to increase the mortgage with the Farm Loan Board. They were on their way out of the loan business, and because I was now Jack Benny's age 39, they refused. Mr. Sweet, our lawyer, advised his sister, Mrs. Teresa Cohen, to lend me the money I had needed, and she assumed the mortgage for a total of $5,000. Let me describe the old kitchen and den that grandfather had added to the original brick house to accommodate the maid who was required to look after grandmother, who was crippled with arthritis. The total addition was 4 rooms, 13 feet square, 2 up and 2 down. A frame building with no insulation, built on cedar posts. The ceilings were only 8 feet downstairs and 7 feet upstairs, a poor match for the 10-foot ceilings in the brick apart. Across nearly all the south wall was a 5-foot sun porch, and behind that, and to the west, was a 10-foot by 12-foot wood shed. Although there was an old coal-burning furnace in the brick part, the only heat from the frame part was supplied by a happy thought, cook stove in the kitchen and a sheet metal box stove in the den. The upstairs got what heat leaked through from downstairs. In the southwest corner of the kitchen was a sink and a hand-operated pump which was connected to the cistern, which was outside and below ground level. It got its supply of water from the roof of the whole house. Located on the east side, a few feet from the den window, was the dug wall that gave us clear cold water which we used for drinking and cooking only. In the center of the kitchen floor, a trap door covered the entrance to the cellar under the brick part. The walls of this cellar entrance were built of stone, the same as the foundation of the brick house. This explained why the center of the floor remained at its original height, while the rotting posts allowed the walls of the frame part to sink gradually. That floor went downhill in every direction from the center. There never was a cook stove that gave more smoke and less heat for the amount of wood burned. Every cold morning in the winter, one could find a little bit of ice on the floor under the sink, and if the pump had not been drained, it would be frozen also. The normal procedure was to light the stove and wait until you could no longer see across the room for smoke, open the door for some real fresh air, and when it finally got going, you were set for the day. The oven was difficult to control, with no gauge to indicate temperature, and if it was used in the summer, it delivered the same amount of heat as it did in January, making the whole kitchen nearly as hot as the oven. I'll never know why they called it a happy thought. The happiest thought I ever had about that stove was the day Aunt Nell, Lib, and I broke it up with an axe and hauled it out to the bushel baskets. We replaced it with a new white enamel cook stove that had a warming closet above the cooking surface, a gauge on the oven, and a reservoir with a tap. Oh, happy day. This must have been in the early 40s because we used it for several years, until the early spring of '51, when we built a new kitchen in what had been the dining room, in the brick part. End of chapter 10.